Does every story begin with a logline?
Loglines are a writer's friend, and I think loglines give the framework of the story. So many writers are resistant to the logline, and the logline tells the executive, tells anyone who's asking what the story is, what the framework is, and it shows that the writer has thought out the concept. So value the process of doing a logline, because when you go to the page from the logline, it will be so much easier. When your logline doesn't work, your story doesn't work. So if you go to the page and discover that the story is not working, it starts with the logline.
How does a logline determine whether the story will work?
A logline, if you have the right components. The writers that I work with, I utilize a formula to help them, which is setup of who, create empathy, dilemma, action, goal, twist of irony. And I have so many writers who will say, oh my God, I can't put all that in a sentence. But when you do, it puts everything in order and it tells you what is going to work, what is not going to work. And one of the tools that I learned helps writers is when the adjective describing the central character at the beginning of the logline is something where we get a sense of the void. So that creates empathy for the character, and we see how the goal is a chance for the transformation.
Wow, all that and just, you said you like to give how many sentences?
I like them to do it in one sentence. However, two sentences work. I mean, there are many people in the industry who are fine with two sentences as long as brevity is something that is there and we get a main sense of the story points, not a rambling second sentence.
Are there certain adjectives that you prefer to use that void?
I like any adjective where I can get a sense of the earlier wound that creates some type of anticipation, that creates some sense of the flaw, where I can get a sense of how the pursuit is going in a direction that gives an opportunity to heal the earlier wound.
Does a screenwriter really need a logline for their movie? Can't they do it later after they've written the script?
I know many writers that do the logline later, and I think that works. However, my preference when working with writers, I notice that when they have the logline, it helps them so much with going to the outline in the script. And when there is a struggle, it's because they don't have a general outline of where they're going. Now, the logline can change, and when you start with the logline and then you see how the story comes through you and you discover that the story is different than where you started with the logline, then you just rewrite the logline.
So it's not set in stone, that it's flexible.
Yes. It is flexible. The logline is something that writers need to value because it's showing that you have a well thought out concept where you are able to deliver it in one or two lines and the receiver immediately knows what your story is.
Do you find with some of the people who take your courses that they're open to flexibility and maybe some are more rigid and they have a hard time being open to changes?
I find resistance a lot. So I do feel that the value of doing something like a course is that the writer will get the information. The writer will see the story tool, then they will see the application of the story tool with the clip and the example of a show or film and how to apply the story tool. So the courses, even though you may have resistance, the value of doing a course is that the writer understands your philosophy on story so that it helps them in knowing how to apply it. So there's a tremendous value in giving story tools, giving philosophy, and then illustrating in action with shows or films that are utilizing the story tool at a high level so that the writer understands how to use it.
Is a logline really the job of the screenwriter? Shouldn't that be left to the marketing department?
No, that should not be left to the marketing department. I have seen marketing, I remember there was a series on Fox a number of years ago where the marketing department marketed the show wrong. And because it was marketed in a way and there was such high hopes for the series, but the marketing made it seem like it's something that it wasn't. And when I saw the show coming from a former current programming executive point of view, I saw the reason that the audience didn't show up because of that gap. Now, I think there are many marketing professionals who know how to coin a story in a way that maybe adds to the writer's intention. However, I feel that no one knows the story like the writer.
What do you mean when you say learn to identify the log lines in your own life?
Emotional truth. So emotional truth is, for me, something that adds depth when you know the emotions that you're exploring in a story, when you've gone through that emotion, then you can take us so much further into it. And I feel like with everything going on in the world right now, that people are craving depth and authenticity, and people are craving the feeling of someone sees me, someone knows me. And that only comes from an emotional truth of someone who has experienced something similar to what the main character is going through.
So you think maybe in the past we wanted to see more of like a dream version of who we are, but then now we actually want to see ourselves, the warts and all represented?
Yes, I do. I think that's very well put. It used to be that you wanted a character, you always want a character you empathize with and you root for. So no matter how flawed a character is, I think the balance of finding positive traits to negative traits is a very big challenge, because it is so important for the writer to create a vulnerability with the character that lets the audience in. And streaming certainly has opened up the gate to character arcs that are going so much deeper. And I think when I compare streaming to television, I feel like film also goes to a depth that streaming goes to. And I think the network shows are starting to catch up with that. But I feel like there's more liberty in streaming and film to go through the transformational arc and to not feel the surface part of the character, but through understanding the wound, the flaw, the dream, the biggest fear, creating multi-dimensional characters that mean something.
What is dilemma?
Dilemma is something that I can't believe I didn't know the value of dilemma when I was an executive. I cannot believe in all the scripts I analyzed over 12 and a half years that I didn't have it termed. I think I loosely understood dilemma in terms of story and conflict. However, it wasn't till after I left the studio and dived into story in every way imaginable that the word dilemma came into my realm. I understood dilemma through structuralist Jeff Kitchen. Yes, that I first took one of my very first structure courses from when I became an executive. And when I left the studio, I re-looked at what I learned from Jeffrey Kitchen, and dilemma somehow just came to me in this way that changed how I see story. And that became everything for developing my brand and looking at the value of dilemma. I feel like so many story people skip over or don't define dilemma. And dilemma is everything to setting up a story when we feel how the character is caught between a rock and a hard place. And for me, I think the aha moment that went beyond what I learned from Jeff was the recognition that the choice the character makes in the dilemma is what defines the external pursuit. So that was my big aha moment that helped me. I think there's so much that we learn from everybody who's studying story. I've been analyzing story for 30 years now. And when I look at my counterparts who think in alignment, like Jeffrey Kitchen, like Michael Haig, like John York, when you have people where Dara Marks, that are seeing story in a similar way, and you kind of look at like what is their terminology versus my terminology, and what is aligning and what is missing, and how do you redefine something so that the writer can grasp it more.
Is dilemma the same as problem?
Dilemma, I feel like, is something that everyone in life understands because we all face dilemmas continuously. So I think the difference between a dilemma and a problem is more of like an obstacle, versus a dilemma is creating a pursuit. So a problem or obstacle is more something that happens to a character on the way to a goal, versus a dilemma is a trigger event. That was another thing that I added to dilemma, was the recognition that a trigger event happens to the character before they face the dilemma. So that was something that was missing in what I understood of it before as well. And that was something that I was like, that's what was missing. So when there's a trigger event that leads a character to a dilemma, then the choice that they make in that dilemma defines a pursuit. So that's what differentiates a dilemma from a problem.
And some of that is set up before the story starts because it's a childhood wound?
Yes. I have come to find in the way I teach and see story that The stories that are hitting at the highest level are stories where it's almost like a math equation. It's almost like you're looking at the trigger event that happens in childhood. Then you're often looking at a trigger event that happens before we enter the story. And then the inciting incident or series trigger and dilemma in TV will split open those two wounds. And then you're developing the character from those three places as a way to add depth to the character.
How does a character's backstory influence their goals and their dilemmas?
When you look at in life and we think about, like, I think a TV show that I feel like perfected the idea, I think when Lost first started and it looked at memories in our life, it looked at, because the way that Lost developed characters at first was the idea of going back to a specific moment in a person's life and kind of arcing that out. And then when I think about the way it evolved was a recognition that the flashback sequence was recognizing that it isn't just one moment in the arc of that moment that influences our choices in the present. It is a series of moments from different life traumas or joys or failures that inform choice. So by going to different life places, then we feel what is influencing why the character is choosing the way they are.
How do past wounds hold a character back?
I like to think that when you look at the past wound, you're looking at starting with the childhood wound. You're looking at something called a negative narrative that we can all identify with, the voices we hear in our head that tell us, I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy of this. That starts with the childhood wound and then progresses from that negative narrative in the mind that goes into a flaw. And when you go into the flaw is what's holding a character back. And again, we all identify with flawed behavior. We all have flaws and we all become conscious of our flaws. Does not mean we heal our flaws. We become conscious, and story is the opportunity for the character to become conscious of that flaw and decide if they want to acknowledge the flaw or if they want to resist working or processing through that flaw in order to get to the goal.
Have you seen it where writers make their characters too perfect or too flawed?
Both. Yes, both. I feel the characters that are too perfect are characters that we can't identify with. Characters, it used to be that when you read scripts and you would read a character description, you would read, oh, she's beautiful or he's handsome. And it started sounding like rubber, like you can't tell anything about a character from that description. And I think writers have gotten to a place where they recognize the value of describing a personality trait is going to bring you much deeper into that character and understanding that character.
How many dilemmas should a main character face?
In the story, there are two pivotal places for the dilemma. The two pivotal places are in the inciting incident setup or in the climax. The value of having a dilemma in both places is a tremendous value because it shows you, is the character going to transform or not? When you look at the structure that I've seen shows and films do, where you have the character often facing a similar dilemma in the climax that they faced in the inciting incident, then the question becomes, did they learn through going through action, obstacles, and stakes? Did they learn what the flaw was that was holding them back? And through that recognition, are they able to move forward? So if the writer puts a dilemma in the opening and the climax, as well as setting up, if you're doing streaming, setting up what's coming next as a cliffhanger, then those are three places that there is tremendous value in using a dilemma. But the opening and the climax are great places for the dilemma.
How much does the viewer really want the character to change? I mean, in real life, most people don't really change that much.
Yeah.
You know, they might work on themselves, but we're still kind of all who we were at 7 years old. So
Yes.
how much do we really want to see our favorite characters evolve?
It is a great question. In film, the transformation is everything because we want to know that the character evolved from how they thought in the beginning to how they think in the end. And there's something that with the format of the beginning, middle, end that fulfills us if we can feel that transformation versus in, say, like when you look at The Sopranos and people would say, well, Tony Soprano is never going to change. So I think that's where it comes to advanced writing, when you recognize, all right, there are certain parts of a person that won't change. However, within the conflict involved in each story, you do want to feel like the character is taking a step of awareness that is causing even a slight change. It's not going to change the character trait of the dominant flaw. However, the awareness has a universal effect for the audience to become aware of what is holding them back. And when you see a character who can move through that block, then it helps the audience to think, if they can do it, I can do it.
Well, I haven't watched the second season of White Lotus, but
Yes.
I don't know if I really want to see Jennifer Coolidge's character change too much. I like the way she is.
Yes.
Because I enjoy watching. She's kind of a lovable hot mess.
Yes.
And I don't know if I want her to become perfect,
Yeah.
you know?
In season 2, she's a lovable hot mess.
Oh, good.
Oh,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
Oh, yes. That's very well put in that description. She is a lovable hot mess in season 2. I feel like Mike White is very authentic to the recognition of what the strengths of that character is, and plays into that. Season 2 is brilliant.
Oh, great. I'm looking forward to watching it.
If you liked season 1, you are going to love season 2.
What is story therapy?
Story therapy is something that I developed with the recognition with how psychology and story are so connected. Whether it's the psychology of the writer, the psychology of the protagonist, or the psychology of the audience, it is all about the transformation that happens. So it's therapeutic. So story therapy was a term that came to me with the recognition I knew about narrative therapy. That was something that I studied when I was taking a deep dive into looking at story from all sides. I'm all about the idea of how do we draw from meditation? How do we draw from spiritual books? How do we look at healing books that help writers, that help us also take a deep dive into the psychology of the character through looking at a wound that didn't heal in the past that is creating a block in the present and preventing the character from hitting the dream in the future. So the recognition of this was that through the pursuit, if the pursuit is an opportunity for the character to become aware of the flaw that is holding them back and an opportunity for them to go one step toward healing that earlier wound, then we get how the story is therapy.
Does the viewer also become healed?
It's interesting. We just watched a show by Abby Morgan called The Split on Hulu. And it's interesting that you say that because when I was an executive at Spelling Television, I went through my parents' divorce after 25 years. Then I went through a divorce myself. So I was in this bubble of pain and of hurt. And I remember going to the president of Spelling and saying, we should do a show on divorce. This is something that would help the audience heal. This is something that 50% of the US is going through. And if they're not going through it, then their family is going through it or they know it through their friends. So the audience is massive. And at that point, so many shows dealt with divorce, but they did surface level. And The Split by Abby Morgan takes a much deeper dive into divorce where I felt like being in a committed relationship and watching 3 seasons of The Split was amazing in that it brought up questions for couples to ask each other by showing through the character transformation of what if somebody has a secret that could get in the way of the marriage. And the idea of through a family law firm, you have Hannah, who is a sought after divorce attorney. And then she has 2 sisters and a single mom that raised them. We find in the series arc that the father returns after a 30-year absence. So you have 3 characters who have the same wound. You're going through the main worldview of Hannah, and Hannah has a secret. And this secret could shatter her marriage. And this secret also involves a love triangle, which is another great thing for writers to recognize when we look at love triangles and you see that the love triangle makes the audience die to know what the answer is and to know which direction, which leads from dilemma as well, that the character is going to go in. So yes, I believe that story is therapy that can heal the audience.
And for those of us who are latchkey kids, myself included, watching Kramer versus Kramer
Yes.
as a young person was definitely, probably I was too young to be watching it, but that was one that you could identify with if you were in a situation like that.
And it stayed with you. Like Kramer versus Kramer stayed with you. You forever remembered, like I, in my mind, immediately go to that scene by the toaster where he is unfamiliar in this space with this child and suddenly has to learn something, and you immediately feel the vulnerability, and it helps you understand the transformation. And then when you're in it, that type of pain, which could go into everybody's biggest fear who's ever been in love, is what is the consequence of loving deeply? And that is the idea of the breakup, the idea of the split. And so when you create story like Kramer versus Kramer, and the split, which was shocking to me that I had never heard about this show, and yet this writer, Abby Morgan, wrote a show called River that I explored that was also brilliant. So when I find shows like these, I love exposing people to them and telling people about them so that they can find them, because it's all about right now, as an audience member, looking for a story that speaks to us, story that we know what the writer is trying to say through the concept and how the central character feels about the concept in terms of the main conflict.
What is the creative concept within a story?
The creative concept could go into the intention of the writer. When you look at things like the external concept, the plot, versus the internal concept having to do with the character transformation and what the character has to learn, and the creative concept of how does one uniquely affect the other. For example, when you look at a show like Ted Lasso, I look at a show like Ted Lasso and I think, oh my gosh, the brilliance of taking a show and grounding it with the idea of two people who have to figure out how to move forward when a marriage doesn't work. And then you add the external plot of a US football coach being brought over to London to coach a Premier League soccer team. Brilliant, because you look at it and you go, story is going to come in. First, you have the agenda of Rebecca, who her motives for bringing Ted Lasso over are more antagonistic. However, seeing the transformation between their dynamic and two people who have parallel life traumas that are going on, and then you add a soccer team where story is coming in, and then you also add an amazing flaw with optimism and the idea of someone who is overly optimistic getting in the way, and then you thrust them into the British audience where this character is considered a wanker because he doesn't have the skill set. And that's where growth happens. So that goes into the idea of a creative concept where the external and the internal are working.
How do fears within a character raise the stakes?
Fears are everything. Fears are also something that we all have. And when you look at what is the character's dream versus what is their biggest fear, when we look at the biggest fear, we're looking at the consequence in the idea of how the internal stakes are affecting the character and how they make choice. There are many writers that don't set up the fear. And when you fail to set up the fear, then you fail to set up the internal and or external stakes at a level where the audience identifies. Again, fear is something very universal in all of us. I always say to writers, what is the worst thing that can happen if the goal is not achieved? And that goes into fear.
Can we explore incorporating the past, present, and future into story?
Yes. The past is the earlier wound. And when you're looking at the past, it can be an event, like in the show The Split, when you have the inciting incident be a father who returns after a 30-year absence. Then you are in immediate recognition of the void in the familial members because of this choice. So the past in that situation is defined by an event, versus the past you can also identify by someone who's just emotionally absent. You can have a parent who is an alcoholic, and there is no specific event, but there is a wound that happens from the emotionally unavailable parent. So that goes into the past. And then the present is something happens which creates the why now that we are entering the story when we are, with the inciting incident that splits open the earlier wound. And that something that happens awakens what happened earlier in life. And that with that awakening, the character is loosely aware, but through the pursuit, they become more aware of the earlier wound. I've seen structures that work incredibly well when you have the earlier wound, when we feel how the inciting incident awakens that wound, then we understand the void. And when we understand the void, that again goes into creating empathy and rooting interest with the character. Then with the future, you are looking at, will the character transform or won't they transform? Did you create the right external plot for the character to become aware of what was holding them back? And is the character in the mindset that they want to heal? And you have characters that we feel the full transformation, and you have characters that you are left with that you feel like they didn't learn. And there's value in both, because in the world, there are people in both mindsets.
Staying within the arc of growth, what's quieting the mind of the sort of the noisy survival mindset? I like that term.
Yes.
Anyway.
I have come into the recognition, the mindset thing was a new thing for me in looking at character and character dynamics, and recognizing that in life, we are in the intellectual mind, we are in the survival mind, or we are in the intuitive mind. And for the majority of our lives, and we are very often rotating from one mindset to the other. For the majority, depending on the life phase and where you're entering with the character of our lives, we are in survival mindset. So being in the survival mindset, there's more to play with the flaws, with the vulnerability, and think about, how do you move the character into the intuitive mindset? What can happen to the character that creates the arc of growth, that moves them into the intuitive mindset? Another parallel that I often think about, like when you think in life how we are all brought up on the idea of codependency. And wherever there's hierarchy, which there is in the family unit from the time we're born, and then we go into the work world and we go into the scholastic world, and there is a hierarchy, and hierarchy creates codependency. And the job for people is to figure out, how do you go from codependency to interdependency? And the value, and I think it used to feel like independency was the key to everything, but then the recognition was interdependency. So when you're looking at how do you move from the mindsets, it's a similar thing that all has to do with the arc of growth of the character.
How could we show a codependent character versus an interdependent character versus an independent character?
So the codependent character is often a character with an alcoholic parent, someone where one of the parents has been absent. So there is a need that is so connected with the comfort of another person, where they cannot distinguish the difference. And the value of the codependent character or person is the untransformed place in a person's life or a character's life, so it gives you somewhere to go. The independent person can also be looked at as a character that has a weakness or a flaw if they're too independent. That is creating an isolation in a different way. An independent person can also be looked at as a plus in that they're not dependent on other people. And then the interdependent person character is the transformed character who has gone through the emotional work of what transpires in the story through the actions, obstacles, stake sequence that leads them to a transformed state. So you can go from a character who is flawed and codependent and have a pursuit that allows them an opportunity to change, and then at the climax they become aware of the flaw, and the choice is, in becoming aware of the flaw, are they going to make a conscious choice when it comes to the resolution, or are they going to stay in the flawed thinking?
So if I were to put labels, and these are my labels, on a codependent character, needy, independent character, selfish, and interdependent would be more balanced?
Yes,
okay.
Perfectly put.
Okay, so that's how I could show
Yes.
these sort of phases that are, okay,
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it all has to do with there's an opportunity for growth. And codependency, like a flaw, is something that is in our lives all the time because of the hierarchy of, and the interesting thing for me, it wasn't until I went through a divorce and someone said, have you ever looked at codependency? And my immediate reaction was, I'm not codependent. Maybe he was codependent. And then I read a book, I think it was called Codependency No More, and it described codependency as needing someone to need you. And I was like, I'm codependent. How wild. So I understand the transformation because I've gone through it. I've done the work to understand, how do I go from the feeling of the hierarchy through the system that society sets up, and then starting my own business and not having the agenda of others as part of the outcome, only having the agenda of how do we get the story to the best place possible. All of that emotional work is part of what led to my transformation.
Yeah, and just like in life, roles can change. Someone can be codependent and then be the one that's sort of sought after by the codependent.
Yes.
Our characters can change too.
Yes.
Maybe they're codependent in one realm, but then they're actually the ones being sought after by a codependent in another, you know.
Yes.
So
And there's value. Like the codependent person is certainly not a bad person. It's not, it's 98%, I think it was the stat, or 90% of society is set up on codependency. So part of our life process and challenge in life having to do with mindset is how do we move from the survival mindset of needing someone to need you into the mindset that you are enough. The flawed thinking, the negative narrative, I'm not enough, I'm not lovable, I don't deserve. And how does the story transform that thinking and bring you to the idea of interdependency and the idea of transformation?
sure, some of our most lovable characters, I mean, you could say Bridget Jones is probably very
Yes.
codependent.
Exactly.
And-
Exactly.
And
Great
White
example.
Lotus.
Yes.
Yeah, the
Very
Jennifer
strong
Coolidge.
example. Yes. Yes, very strong example.
But then she can flip on you and start, so she's real interesting. I'm not sure what her, what they would put in the DSM, whatever it is, 5 now,
Yes.
or whatever the book is, but what her classic case would be. But some very interesting stories have all been built around a codependent character.
Oh, exactly. Because you think about what happens to a character when they lose their comfort blanket, which is a person. What happens to them, which we all do in life. We move on from being in the family unit to going to college to the idea of moving away from. And as I always remember this saying, which I loved, that kind of frames the idea. When I was at Spelling Television, we did a show called Queen Supreme, and there was a quote that one writer used in an episode that we spend the first half of our lives running away from home and the second half trying to get back.
Oh, that's great.
Isn't it?
What do some writers get wrong with flashbacks and some are good at?
That's an excellent question. That is something that many writers struggle with, the flashback sequence. And you have to recognize when you have a flashback, you are interrupting the flow of story. So if you're going to interrupt the momentum in the present moment, it has to be something that is advancing the plot in the present by going to the past. And many writers will make the mistake of not understanding that for the first thing. And then they'll have flashbacks where there's not an arc of the flashback. And when you have flashbacks, you need to go through the thinking of, how is this advancing my plot? This is going to take the audience out of story. So is it paralleling the arc in a way that there's a value in going to the past as a way to better understand and add depth to the present so the character can get to the future?
If I remember correctly, I know we were talking about Emily the criminal off camera.
Yes.
We don't really see flashbacks of what her initial dilemma was.
Right.
And I think that makes it so interesting. It really keeps you hooked.
It does. Like the interesting thing is, there are many writers who will say, why do you have to have a wound? Do you have to have a wound? Do you have to go into the past? How come the present arc can't carry that weight? And the answer to that is the present arc, if it is a compelling enough dilemma and we feel it in the framework of the setup, can carry a lot of that. The value of understanding through not going to flashback, and like in a character, like you mentioned, through not going to the flashback, but putting the weight in the present arc, but maybe through dialogue and character dynamic in the present, we are feeling the void of the past through choice, through action, without having to go there or to know anything specific, because we are seeing it. And writers have perfected, I have seen writers, certainly when you look at the genre of the action film, you are often looking at, you're not going to go into the, but I even think the action film has evolved in a way to where we do feel the earlier wound, and there are different methods that we're able to thread together the emotional arc in the same way. So I think that show does a brilliant job of setting up a strong enough dilemma in the present where we feel something from the past without having to flashback.
Right, because if I remember correctly, her dilemma, which we weren't sure if we were going to see the flashback, is brought up a few times, and it's hinted at or
Yes.
it's directly talked about, but we never, it really is this thing that keeps you hooked.
Yes.
And, you know, the opening scene, if I remember correctly, was the job interview, and I
Yes.
thought that was just so brilliant how it was played out.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think it can work. Where you
It
don't.
can work, and I think also, like, you tapped into something, the idea of the puzzle of story. What are you creating that is creating anticipation, that the audience is playing a mind game through what you're revealing in the present that makes you curious about the past? When you look at a show like The Flight Attendant, and you start with a flashback, you start with the flaw. We see the very flawed behavior with her promiscuity and her partying and her drinking in the beginning. So you start with the flaw. The flaw is the story of the wound, so that creates anticipation. Then we get a hint of a flashback about her with her father, and the idea of a deer, I think, is the first flashback. And then by the climax, we learn that she lost her father, but that's not giving us the whole thing. That's giving us two pieces of the puzzle, which is creating a curiosity, which is creating anticipation for the series arc, which we're going to get the full story of what happened to Emily's father. How does that connect with her flawed behavior that we see from the start? And how does the pursuit allow her an opportunity to heal?
So do you think flashbacks are effective when they're hinted at?
I do, and I also encourage writers to think about how can you use your background and the character action and choice to tell a story without having to go to the flashback. So, for example, something that was so brilliant with The Split was, and I missed it the first time I saw the first episode, was when you opened, you saw Hannah and her husband were at opposite ends of the bed, and you felt the void in the middle. And then you cut to a series of pictures of Hannah and her sisters and her mom. And then there's a picture where you can see that the father was cut out. And that was a hint, without us knowing yet what specifically happened. We're like, huh, what was that? You know, so I think that when you quietly give us information from the past in the present, there's a tremendous value if you do it in a way artistically that creates a curiosity and an anticipation from the audience.
So yeah, don't be too overt with the flashbacks.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I believe that there is a value to flashbacks. You're going to have many development executives who will say, don't flashback, don't do voiceovers, that's lazy writing. I hear it over and over and over again from writers who tell me that they're hearing these instructions, and then you watch the Golden Globes, you watch the Emmys, you watch the Oscars, and stories that have flashbacks are the stories that are hitting in the deepest way. The message is, don't gratuitously take us to the past. Only take us to the past if there's value in the present story.
Yeah, so any type of, especially like with an orphan story, like with, forgive me, I'm blanking on the name, with Dev Patel and Nicole Kidman.
Yes.
Lion? Yes.
Lion, yes.
That one, a very effective
Yes.
flashback, because you needed to know.
That was like a double narrative. That was very effective in the recognition, if I remember correctly. I think that, or no, it was linear, but we were in the past before, but that inciting incident was so powerful with what happened that changed the trajectory of the boy's life.
Sure, and in Queen's Gambit as well, another
Yes.
orphan story, we needed to know certain things about how the mom felt and her sort of worldview.
Queen's Gambit is brilliant. The Queen's Gambit, I was so emotionally connected to that story, and what they utilized that was so valuable is we were in the heat of the wound when it happened, and we felt it, and we're like, you're in. When you feel the wound in the heat of the moment that it happens, and then you have the puzzle of what didn't I know that transpired before and after that moment that is going to affect the present plot, and you bring us to those gaps, then we're in. And there's a value in that. There was a show with Maggie Gyllenhaal called An Honorable Woman, if I remember correctly, where it starts in, and it's not, when you start in the wound, it's not considered a flashback. If you start in the childhood wound and then you cut to 25 years later, then you give us that piece that we need without having to go to a flashback. You're in real time when the wound happens. Then there was a transition. So in An Honorable Woman, we see a little girl, a little boy, their father, they sit down to this formal dinner at this shishi place, and the waiter suddenly stabs the father. And we see the blood go on the little girl, and then we cut to Maggie Gyllenhaal in her 20s, in the same place that she was when her father was killed. And the parallel of what led to her father's life and a choice that she was making in the series setup was linked. So by literally giving us that page and a half, 2 pages, we're in. Like, you're like, I want to be a part of this character's pursuit. I want to know, how does a character move beyond a trauma like that without having to, and then it did go into a double narrative where you understood a different point in time and how it paralleled what was going on with the present plot. And there was tremendous value because of the multi-dimensions.
Jen, I believe you like to boil down story structure into 4 parts: trigger, dilemma, choice, and pursuit.
I've had so many different components of the looking at story. So it's all about different angles. So yes, that is one formula that I've used, and I've also used the idea of another 4 points that I've used is the idea of biggest fear, dream, and the trigger event and the dilemma. And so looking at how those things affect story.
We always hear about 3-act structure.
Yes.
Why do you break story into 4 parts?
I am always seeking story tools. So I analyze story in the brilliance of what is being done right now in film and in streaming. I am always looking for tools and how do I break it down in a way that the writer understands. And of course, obviously when you look at the 3-act structure, you're also looking at Act 2 as in 2 parts. So you're essentially looking at 4 parts of the story. So, and I think that there are, you never know like what comes through you where you hit these aha moments when you're watching story and you're like, all right, these are the points that work. I remember recently I was looking for components, key points that take us into voice. And I read a pilot where the voice was so clear. And I hit the aha moment of looking at the concept, the main conflict, and how the protagonist feels about that conflict. And when I looked at those, and the title in the case of this pilot was the title, the concept, the main conflict, and the character's expression of how they felt. That for me was like, all right, this is voice. This is what voice is. We know why the writer is telling the story through understanding these connecting points, and we feel the voice of the writer through the central character and how that central character feels about the main conflict.
And so voice doesn't necessarily mean first-person narrative. It could be told third person and we can still feel a strong voice?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Voice is felt in so many different ways. And voice even, you can feel voice in the action lines. You can feel it, I've seen writers do prose in the action lines where you have an inanimate object have a personality trait, and suddenly you're bringing an inanimate object to life where the audience can feel it. Voice is there versus whether it's the third person, whether it's the first person. Understanding something in the depth of the character that gives you a sense of why the writer is writing the story and what is this story really about.
So like in Wednesday Addams, the hand
Yes.
has its own
Yes.
voice and its own sort
Exactly.
of narrative, right?
The hand is symbolic of so much. That show, I've only seen a few episodes, but that show is so brilliant.
It is, yeah.
Because I was trying to think, I thought, all right, like the film Top Gun Maverick, you have a built-in audience because we knew. So first going into Wednesday, you are looking in, you have a built-in audience from the Addams family. Then you're grounding it with the idea of a character who feels like an outcast going to a boarding school for outcasts and continues to feel on the outside looking in. And that is so encompassing so much of what's going on in the pandemic, that I feel like it's hitting a note. And because we feel like we know this character, but we don't know this character at the depth that this show is bringing us into this character. So that it has an immediate audience following, as well as I think old generation and new generation finding a value in the story, and everything that's going on in the world making us feel that value. And then you look at Top Gun Maverick and you're like, all right, everybody saw the first Top Gun, and we are all in that wound. I mean, we felt the wound with what happens to Goose in that movie. So that is something that has stayed with us. And then you have this film, which is phenomenal, take us into going beyond that through Goose's son, and Maverick being put in a new dilemma where the past, since we were all in it, is haunting him and affecting choice in the new. So that was an incredible way to look at, how do I get an audience by finding an audience who knows the wound, because, and even if they miss that movie, is still going to find fulfillment from looking at this. But chances are most people have seen the first movie before going into the second movie. So I look at both those projects and I look in awe at how the thinking went into and how the outcome is amazing.
Is 3-act story structure a rule that you can break?
It is. It is. It's not a rule that anyone recommends breaking. It is there to help you. When I look at rule breaking with writers, I look at, certainly I feel like in streaming, rules are being broken all over the place. They're being broken, or in film with Aaron Sorkin, or they're being broken by seasoned writers. You know, when you have a seasoned writer break a rule because of the confidence they have in understanding story and transformation and the arc of growth, and story is coming through them in a way that maybe doesn't adhere to 3 acts or what it's supposed to be, there's a value as long as a writer knows what they're doing. And the 3-act structure has a purpose. The 3-act structure works. However, there are so many brilliant things being done and said that could be turning it on its head a little bit here and there. And some of it is working, and I would say the majority of it is failing. But there are certain moments that are working because of the seasoned writer, or even if the writer isn't seasoned, but they have something to say that we feel, rules can be broken.
What is a scene?
A scene is like one step toward the bigger picture. So in the scene, you're looking at who wants what and what is getting in the way. Who wants what is getting in the way? How do you create the small piece of the bigger puzzle through looking at the scene, and also understanding what is the conflict in the scene is a struggle that I see a lot of writers go through. You often will find scenes that have no conflict, and you have no sense of who wants what and what is getting in the way. So by simply understanding the scene as a part of the greater picture and how you are creating a step toward an outcome while escalating the conflict is an important part of scene work.
What happens in a good scene?
A good scene is a strategic approach to how does the scene serve the purpose of advancing the external plot as well as the internal with the character development. So a good scene brings us into the personal so that we feel the personal as well as understanding how it's a step in the external plot.
What do a lot of new writers get wrong when they write scenes?
I would say the biggest thing that I see writers get wrong with certain scenes is they forget that I remember I came upon 3 things that I thought about should be in the scene, and the idea is the desire, the conflict, and the conflict being the flaw. So you're looking at the want, the conflict, and the why as a part of a scene. And when you have a scene where we lose sight of what does the character want, what is the main goal, and we don't feel it in the scene, that is probably one of the biggest mistakes I see made. When I get halfway through a script and I look at a scene because I'm feeling lost, because I lost the why, the want, and the conflict with the flaw.
So there's no filler scenes in movies where those elements don't exist within each one. Like there has to be that to move the story along.
There's value if there's that. I think that you can, as we talked about rule breaking, I think you can always find a way to, voice trumps a lot of the rules. If we feel the voice in a scene, and yet there is one of the 3 components I mentioned missing, then the voice can make a difference. And if we understand how that scene is a part of the bigger puzzle and understand the intention of the writer within that, then again, you can look at rules and say the writer was able to communicate a message without having to have specific things.
You look at, let's say, Sideways. I know it goes a few years back, but it seems like in every scene, Miles is in a dilemma with himself, really,
Yes.
because he feels so inadequate,
Yes.
whether he wants to blame others for it, but he's always, something relates to that he's being slighted somehow.
Yes. Well, that's because of the flaw work, and the flaw that we feel stemming from the wound that we're feeling a part of from the beginning, and how there's an escalation of that. But also not feeling in that movie that there's a full understanding of the want in a way that is transformative with the character. Like looking at the want and going, all right, what specifically does this character want, and how the sideway pursuit is bringing the character to that point. In that character, if I remember correctly, and it's been so long since I've seen that film, but that film really resonated. Certainly from someone who's been through divorce, someone who knows what pain looks like and what the healing process looks like. I feel like that was a film that everyone identified with, and certainly the whole Merlot aspect of the wine industry and all that. Like, it stays with you, and you remember that character because of the wound and the flaw work, and looking at the transformation within it, that story has stayed with me. So that is a good example of looking at it in the way that you're talking about.
Right, because it seems like there were no really useless scenes in that film whatsoever. Everything set something up where Miles was going to somehow feel badly about himself.
Yes.
And luckily he had this other component, which was the Thomas Hayden Church character, who felt so incredible about himself
Yes.
to remind him of how low he was. So there was always this tension of, here was this person on a pedestal and here was Miles.
Yes.
And it was a wonderful
And what
friction.
you tapped into that's so good there is polarity. When you have polarity in story and you have one character who's weak where the other is strong and vice versa, then again, that's something very universal in life. Polarity is another thing for me, like Dilemma, where there was this massive aha, and Sideways is an excellent example of looking at how polarity adds so much depth to story and to character transformation.
What does it mean to start a scene late and leave early?
To start a scene late means your audience could feel stuck with how the scene is fitting into the overall picture. And to end it early, there is a term called the button of a scene, where we feel the button at the end of the scene that's in the overall meaning of the story. So you also want to look at scenes as, in another respect that I thought about in talking about this, is your scenes should always set up where your character is going to next. So another mistake that writers make in scenes is we should never arrive in a scene and not know how we got there.
Interesting. I'm thinking of Sophie's Choice.
Yes.
And one of the many incredible scenes in the film is where the Kevin Kline character arrives home late.
Yes.
And finds her drinking with the neighbor, and just sort of the tension in the room. And so I guess it's been a little bit since I've seen it, but just how those scenes were set up, because there was always like a weird implication of something. We didn't know totally what it was. We didn't know what Sophie was. We knew some things she was dealing with. We didn't know everything.
You didn't know everything, and that's where scene work comes in handy as far as the whole linking aspect. I remember another thing that I remember from Jeffrey Kitchen was the idea, and I learned this at the beginning of my career as an executive: take a script from the back to the front and make sure that every preceding scene sets up the next scene. And it was a great tool. So easy, like it still stands in my mind. And when I covered procedurals as a current executive, it particularly came into play of, oh my gosh, that I get that. That's something that stays. And there are so many scenes where you're like, how did we get here? What is this? I didn't feel the setup. And because you didn't feel the setup, it's because the writer didn't do the setup. And the significance of setting up where the character is going next, or having a puzzle, as you're mentioning, that we understand how it fits the greater picture. And if we don't understand, then that comes down to the writing.
And even for time lapses, let's say I realize every scene usually involves a time lapse, but like a major yearly or decade time lapse.
Yes.
How are we playing with the scene in that, or tying them together?
I think the time lapses are interruptive, like the flashbacks. So you need to know when you are going to have a time lapse, how that affects the overall goal. Like if in the middle of a script you have a 10-year jump, then you're going, well, how does that affect the initial goal? I remember there was a show that I think in editing, they probably shifted it. If I remember correctly, I think I read an article on it. There was a show called The Night Manager with Hugh Laurie, where they did do, in the middle of the pilot episode, they did a time jump. However, the goal remained the same, because the goal still had to do with bringing the arms dealer down. So that was a time jump that worked. So I always think when you're doing time jumps, it needs to have a strategy, just like your arc of growth has a strategy, just like your story arc has a strategy. Your time jump can't take us out of where we feel the main plot is going. We need to understand how the time jump factors in to the goal.
What's the difference between the main character's wound and flaw?
They're interconnected. The wound and the flaw is interconnected. Something that I recognized with story was the flaw is the story of the wound. And with that recognition, I saw how strategy-wise, a lot of stories are starting with the flaw in its shining glory. The value in starting with the flaw is that you are curious about the wound. You don't have the answer to what the wound is, but you are curious, why is the character the way they are? And then by the climax, we're getting a fuller view of the wound. So the difference is the wound is what happens to the character that creates the void. The flaw is how we see it come out, how the character is escaping the wound through distraction, through distracted behavior with the flaw.
Right, because if I think back to Emily the Criminal, she talked about living with her grandmother.
Yes.
So it hints that's something she wasn't raised by her parents.
Yes.
So we knew
And you
something
feel the
was
void.
up. Right.
Yes.
So we don't totally know.
Yes.
But we're wondering, why did she have these series of events that happened? And then I think it doesn't come out right away. Mm-hmm. So it keeps you hooked.
It's the puzzle. Mm-hmm. And knowing how to strategize the puzzle is everything. And writers need to recognize that it's all a journey. The same thing, like when you think about the transformation with falling in love, how when we first fall in love, we don't know enough about romantic love to know how to be, to know exactly what, and we're in this continuous learning process. And it is the same thing with the idea of this transformation where you don't just know what to do with story. You don't just know, oh, this is how I'm going to break it up and this is what the strategy is. The more that you study story, the more that you live story, the more that you feel story, your mind starts to see it in a depth that you never knew was possible until you get there.
And what's great is when you talk about falling in love, so many characters, I'm just thinking back to like Swingers or any Christmas movie where it's like someone's been jilted or
Yes.
they've been quote unquote abandoned, no one's calling.
Yes.
And in obsessing over that person, they then meet someone new.
Yes.
Who then later on it pays off where that abandoner calls and they don't need them anymore.
Exactly
so
right. That's exactly right. It is all in the transformation. And when we look at our life, and like in my own personal arc, I look at when I went through 2 defining moments that sold my book Storyline, Finding Gold in Your Life Story, and Change Your Story, Change Your Life. It had to do with a long relationship that ended in a short marriage early on in life, and then a career trajectory that was interrupted. And in looking at, if those 2 moments hadn't happened, I wouldn't have found what I view as the love of my life for the last 9 years. I wouldn't have met him unless those 2 negative things happened in my life. So I think the object of story is to teach people when bad things happen, there is a greater purpose as it links to the healing of the earlier wound and as it links to the overall growth in the life process. And because so many of us in life, when we're in the heat of our all is lost moments, aren't ready for that awareness, story is continuously making us conscious of that awareness.
And do you think that in a good story, that all is lost moment has to then resurface later on down the line once things are quote unquote better for the character to really test them?
I don't think always. I think it works tremendously if it's done well. I think always would make story too formulaic and too predictable. So I think if it's done in a creative way where we see the dilemma in a different light, now that the character has done the emotional work through the action, obstacle, stake sequence, and at the climax you're at a place of did they or didn't they come into the transformation through the recognition of the flaw, then yes. So looking at that.
Does every protagonist need a goal?
Absolutely. If there's one thing in story, you just nailed the most important thing in story. The goal is everything. The external goal as well as the internal goal. The understanding of the want versus the need, and the recognition that often the character wants something externally that isn't in the transformed thinking of the mindset things that we talked about with the idea of survival mindset, intuitive mindset, and intellectual mindset. So the goal is if you don't know what the character wants, the story doesn't work. And knowing that, is the character going to get what they want externally, or are they going to get it internally, is what keeps the audience interested in the story.
Do you ever say to writers, I feel like the goal for your character, the stakes need to be risen. It's not important enough, but it doesn't seem like it would be sensible for most people.
All the time. Stakes is something, the dream is an aha moment that I had in my study of story. When you set the dream up at the beginning, the dream sets up the stakes. When we know what the character wants and why they want it through the dream, then we get a glimpse of the internal and the external stakes. So the dream is a pivotal tool in the setup that can make all the difference in the world with feeling the stakes.
So is that something that you see sometimes with new writers, that their goal, it's too small of a goal, you need to really up the ante?
Yes, and that goes into the idea of what a question I ask all the time is, what is the worst that can happen if the goal is not achieved? And that means that if the answer is they could, miss going on a date, or they could something so small that in the bigger scheme of things doesn't feel like a life and death type of scenario, then it's not working.
Do you ever recommend people do like a Q&A with their character?
Yes, I do. In story therapy. That's interesting you asked that question. Excellent question. In story therapy, I have a whole set of questions that I give writers that is the idea of understanding the character's awareness of what's holding them back, of what happened in the past, of what do they want, and getting to know your character by having this type of interview with your character.
And then too, it seems like then the characters would really come out more if you're doing this like interview
Yes.
with your character. It seems like almost it would become more and more real to you.
Oh yeah, I think the writer knowing the character and feeling the character from the inside is so important with how the audience is going to experience the character. Something I recognize that a lot of writers do is they give the wound to the wrong character. So we'll end up knowing more about a supporting character than we will about the central character. And when that happens, then we're going, what do we know about the central character? Why don't we feel the same type of pull? And we start to go, why isn't it the other character's story? Since the other character has more to lose with the stakes because we know their wound. Another thing that I'm seeing a lot of stories do, which is fantastic, is they are developing the wound for the antagonist in more depth than they have. And as long as the protagonist, we feel their wound at a high level, and you parallel, so you have a strategy with the wound of the antagonist, then it can work really well.
Is there a danger in the writer identifying too much with the protagonist because it's like too precious to them? If the lines are blurred and it's like, well, essentially this is really me.
Yes.
Is there a danger in that?
Yes, because of exactly what you might think. When the character is too much like them and they feel like, I wouldn't do that, yet dramatically it doesn't work in the story. And that has to do with like writers who are telling story from an autobiographical angle versus an angle of emotional truth. When they're telling a story from an autobiographical angle, they get stuck on the idea of, well, that didn't happen. Well, that didn't happen, without recognizing that life doesn't happen in dramatic structure.
Is there a way to avoid writing on-the-nose dialogue?
Yes, with dialogue, obviously the best thing you can do with dialogue is recognize when you go out and you listen to conversation. People do not speak in complete sentences. And you record or you think about, how are people speaking in a way that feels authentic? And dialogue also reveals so much about things like character traits and flaws and life phases. So you want to think about things like, where is this character in their life? And when I look at the life process, is my dialogue reflective of where this character is? Is my dialogue reflective of the want? Is my dialogue reflective of the conflict that the character might feel internally? Is my dialogue reflective? You always want to think something in scene work. You always want to think of, is the scene revealing character while advancing plot?
How do you write emotion without stating emotion?
That's a great question. Emotion all comes down to the setup of things like the dream, the biggest fear, the audience feeling the void. So when you enter the story, you want to think about the idea of what is making the character stuck when we enter the story. And the feeling of what is making the character stuck when we enter the story goes into the setup of the emotional arc. So you're not hitting on the head what the emotion is. Instead, you're giving us a sense through subtext of the void, and then you're escalating the emotional arc through understanding what is getting in the way with the void, and how the pursuit can help the character process the past so that they can move toward the future goal.
I'm thinking too about want. How do you state want in dialogue? Like, I'm thinking back to the White Lotus.
Yes.
And the Jennifer Coolidge character has found this young woman who will just sort of listen to her and be
Yes.
her sounding board.
Yes.
But she's also manipulating her.
Yeah.
And it's revealed in these little tells about the business. Oh, I don't have to. We'll talk about that later, right?
Yeah.
But she throws it out and then she takes it away again.
Yes. Yes. I think with dialogue, there's a value in the subtext of the want, like you're describing. I also think that the want is something that you can hit on the nose with the character just declaring, I want blank. And I think that I have seen that done incredibly well, where it's great for the audience because you clearly know what the character wants. So there's a value in the subtext as long as we don't miss the want. And there's a value in the dialogue sometimes defining the want on the nose for the audience.
Yeah, so you could see both wants were very clear. The Jennifer Coolidge character wanted to be needed, and then the other woman was hoping to make it out of this sort of hotel treadmill of working, behind the scenes with these clients. And so both wants are very present in like the dinner conversation. I think they'd gone out to dinner.
Yes.
And yeah.
And you could see in those wants, in that's a great thing to illustrate. You can see in the wants of those two characters that it has to, with Jennifer Coolidge, it has to do with what's making her stuck, and how the dream and being in business with the other woman could be an answer for her. And for the other woman, Jennifer's being stuck and needing to go in a direction could be an advantage for her. So when you look at the want, I always say when you're setting up co-protagonists, we need to understand how one is the answer to the other's dilemma. And that comes down to want. Like when you look at the show Hacks, and you have a sense of Deborah's character and the idea of her being in the life phase where work is stopping because of her age, and you contrast that with a younger character who's asked to help punch up her jokes, which could help her dilemma. And then with the younger character, you also have work is stopping because of something she said on Twitter that caused her career that was blossoming to suddenly stop. So you have two characters who their wants are in connection and they are the answer to the other's dilemma.
What should a writer know about monologues, or should a writer try to avoid monologues in their film or TV or play?
I love that question. I think that so many story experts will say no more than 4 to 5 lines of dialogue. So of course, when you hit a monologue, you're going way over that. If the monologue serves the intention of the story, there is value in the monologue. When you look at Aaron Sorkin, who could have a full page or 2 pages worth, and it serves the story in such a brilliant way that brings you to a sense of depth and understanding of the character, there's a value. However, just know that the rule of thumb is you should have 4 to 5 lines of dialogue. So the value of brevity, the value, I often tell writers, you want to look at these big, huge chunks of dialogue and figure out how you can say the same thing in less words. What is the focal point of the intention, and how can you hit the same depth? Because the consequence of too many words is you lose the focal point. Certainly in comedy, when you're looking at cadence and you're looking at the cadence when you have over 3 to 4 lines of dialogue, you lose that cadence. The joke gets buried because there are so many words. So there's a value in the monologue if it serves the intention, but there's also a value in, can you say something with the same amount of depth without so many words?
Yeah, I'm thinking one place, and this is an old reference, but Say Anything with John Cusack.
Yes.
And where he goes on this sort of tirade about he doesn't want to, produce anything. You see this guy's like anti-corporate, anti-consumerism. Like he shows that he's this is who he is in his monologue.
Yes.
And here he's got this woman that he's in love with who's from like more of a wealthy
and
family.
It serves.
Right,
yes,
right. So it shows the polarity.
Incredibly well. That's
right.
a great example. That is done incredibly well because it serves the story and the character and the audience, because it brings them into that desire.
Right, so it shows kind of who he is.
Yes.
It's very limited in what he wants to do.
Yes.
There's not a lot of room, but he knows he likes being with her.
Yeah.
But and they kind of come from these opposite worlds. And
yes, and the polarity going into
yeah.
that, yes.
What is the all is lost moment?
The all is lost moment is when the character is as far away as possible from achieving the goal. The significance of the all is lost moment is in hitting rock bottom, the character has an epiphany. And the epiphany is the recognition of the flaw that is holding them back. Then the connection to the character and the action that they take at the top of the last act that leads to the achievement of the goal should reflect the consciousness of the flaw and acknowledgement or the denial of the flaw with the choice that is made that leads to the resolution.
So the all is lost moment is so important in getting the character to change.
Yes. In hitting rock bottom, again, universally, we all hit our rock bottom moments. We all hit our moments where they say each person has at least 3 to 4 of these moments in life. So these are moments that are identifiable. And when the audience is watching the character hit rock bottom, they're identifying with what that is. And then when they see the character's awareness become conscious of the flaw, then they look at their own lives and think about, could I make better choices that could lead me to a stronger outcome by acknowledging the flaw. So when we see in story all the time when it's done well, then we get empowered in our own lives of how we can transform our all is lost moments into growth opportunity.
So that's interesting. So you say that most people will hit 3 or 4 all is lost moments in their life? Does it have anything to do with age or financial status or anything?
It doesn't, because I have so many people who will say to me, are young writers not ready when they're writing? And I said, all depends on what happens in their life. If you have a young writer whose parent died when they were 10, they become old souls. So those are the types of moments, certainly with us going through what we all went through with the idea of Black Lives Matter, and us feeling that connection with characters that are going through so much loss, that these are life-defining moments, that it's not because they're 25 or they're midlife or they're old. It's because these are things that are happening to them in the moment that could be at any life point in any life phase. So these defining moments are like turning points that happen in our life, and they can happen at any time. And I think the phase of life that we're in determines how our character will evolve from the choices we make because of what happened to us.
Does the all is lost moment usually result from a goal like a failure of a goal?
The all is lost moment is like your final, and another thing to think about with the all is lost moment, it should always be due to an action that the character takes toward the goal versus something that happens to them. So you always want to think of, yes, number one, it's so important that you feel the goal in the all is lost moment, that you feel that the character is as far away as possible from that achievement, and that they are being active. And it's kind of like in life, like you hit a brick wall so many times before you start to recognize that's not the way to do it. Your all is lost moment is serving the same purpose. It's telling you your flawed behavior is getting in the way of your dream, and unless you do something to change by becoming more aware and conscious, you are not going to have the same outcome with the resolution as you will if you acknowledge what's going on with the flaw and what's holding you back.
And is the all is lost moment the same as the dark night of the soul?
In film, I have, like, say for example, in a film like Avatar, you have the all is lost moment and the dark night of the soul is two separate moments. In many films, they are one and the same. So I think it all depends on the structure of the film. I think there are plenty of writers where they're seasoned writers who know how to serve both, and both are part of the same type of sequence, which is something that is bringing the character aware of what is holding them back as it links to the dream and the goal.
How long does the all is lost moment last in a story?
The all is, well, it depends on the story, but it is quick. It is something where, now the all is lost sequence could be something, depending on the story, that could feel like it's building from the midpoint on. But ideally, you're looking for the moment itself is something where we feel that due to the action taken, they hit the all is lost moment, and this is something that quickly happens where they feel at wit's end as far as the goal.
What if the character refuses to change?
Then you're having a tragedy. Then that brings you into the idea of a film that is a tragedy because the character resists the acknowledgement of the flaw.
Do you see that with a lot of writers? Do they want their characters to change?
I see resistance for the idea that what we've talked about earlier is that so many people in their lives, it takes so much before they're willing to change. So, however, I feel like when you look at the idea of change, everything's incremental. Like you look at a character who you say, no, they'll never change. Like when you look at, for example, when you look at the comedy and they say in comedy, the character doesn't change. Yet, because now certainly in streaming, when you have the half-hour drama, then you're taking on the component of the transformation where the character does change. And I even think many comedies are also now recognizing the value of incremental change, even if it's not a massive change, but a small change in the awareness of the character.
How many pilots have you helped writers sell?
Right now, I am at 105. 106 is in action, and I also just heard about another one that would make it 107.
Wow. These are TV pilots that
Yes.
for streaming or also network?
Both.
Both, okay,
Yes.
great.
Both. And so writers are aware, like when you sell a pilot, it doesn't mean it goes to series. It means you're selling a pilot. So I've had, I think, 7 shows now go to series where they get picked up and they're on the air. So that is a ratio that's very important for writers to be aware of. You can sell a pilot, but so many pilots are bought per season, and the percentage that get to series, that get picked up, is a much smaller number. And when I opened my business, my whole focal point as a consultant was the recognition that the TV pilot is everything in taking a non-working writer into being a working writer, or in an unrepresented writer to a represented writer. So my whole focus when I started my business was how do I demystify the pilot writing process so writers know how to write a script that will sell, because having that recognition is what will lead to an outcome, because scripts need to hit it out of the ballpark in order for something to sell, in order for a writer to staff.
What are a few things that new writers get wrong about selling a pilot, in addition to they'll be bought but not necessarily be made, which is news to me?
I would say some of the things they do wrong is the strategy of the season arc. So the season arc and the central conflict for the character, in that they are torn in 2 different directions, is everything to the longevity of the show. And I think the mistake that writers make is they're so focused on the pilot episode without the recognition of, are they building a big enough well to where we can see 1 season or several seasons of story coming from the concept.
So is it just that they don't have room for dilemma, or is it just too small of an idea? What would stop someone from having something that had a big enough arc?
I think what stops someone from having a big enough arc. It has to do with also moving the mindset of a feature writer, beginning, middle, end, to a TV writer, which is you are bookending your pilot with a strategy that is setting up season one. So you have your series arc that is bookending and setting up season one. Then if the strategy of the pilot arc is done correctly, the pilot arc is one step toward the season one question. So by the end of the pilot, we should have a very clear sense of what is the internal and the external question that is driving season one. And that's how you build a season arc. For example, an old show that more people know, The Split, that I watched recently, has probably one of the best season arc setups of any show I've seen, because it creates 3 seasons based on the setup of the father who was gone for 30 years, the eldest daughter who has a secret that could cost her her marriage, and the well of story that's coming from a family law practice that has to do with family law and domestic disruption. So those 3 components bring in the idea of story. And those 3 components built 3 seasons of story. And then a show like Homeland, the older show that I was mentioning, you look at the brilliance of the season 1 setup with the idea of, is Brody the prisoner of war that turned, or isn't he? And every episode is yes, no, toward the season 1 question.
How does a writer get in the room with the right people to pitch a television show?
There lies the mystery of so much. The writer should first focus on the writing. So many writers will get focused on, how do I get in a room? And the thing is, if the writing is where it needs to be and hits it out of the ballpark, you will get into the room. And a way I've seen, every writer has a different journey for how that happens. You can have writers who enter all the competitions and enter some of the more well-known competitions and hit at the finalist or semifinalist or above, and they'll start to get recognition within the community because of how they're performing in competitions. I've seen writers, I always, with my writers, tell them, if you hit semifinals or above in a competition, let me know, and I will give you a shout out on all of my social media, because I have a lot of executives, agents, managers on my social media. So my feeling is, if I see someone who's getting great accomplishments in the competition world, it means that something is working. So that's one channel. Then you have the channel of the writing programs that are at the studio and networks, that are these diversity programs or just writing fellowships, where the intention of the program is to identify, out of sometimes 2,000 to 3,000 submissions, what are the top 8 writers that are at a level that they could be a working writer, and then to help facilitate that outcome. Then you also have the channel of just the pure strength of the writing, that you do the work to get it in the right hands. And that could involve working as a writer's assistant and absorbing and being a sponge. And utilizing your relationships when you know your script is in a strong enough place to get you to an outcome. So it all comes down to the script. It all comes down to knowing that you don't want to get into a room until your script is at a level that could sell. Also knowing that whatever happens in that room, if you land in the room too early and you're not ready, there's something to learn from that as well.
Does that happen a lot?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, you have development executives that are, listening to so many pitches a day that you can, writers have to recognize that you can go into a room and feel like you don't have an audience because you have a blank look on the development executive face, which happens a lot purposely because they don't want to give you a sense of what's going on inside. Or you can have someone who has a bazillion fires that they're putting out that their attention isn't quite there. And I always tell writers, you have the power to read a room and know when you need to grab their attention and know when you are losing their attention, how to bring it back. So never feel like when you're losing the room that there is no way to bring it back, because you can bring it back. And always in your mind with your pitch, have an idea of, all right, a common place that you lose a room when you're pitching is in the character descriptions. And if you don't give the logline and you're giving this rambling view of the characters, and the people hearing your pitch are trying to think of the framework of who is significant in what way and why, you're losing them. So then you can help save yourself by, if you recognize you never gave the logline, give the logline. That helps, like brings it back on track. So, and there's value in all of it. Like the failure in pitching brings knowledge, and every working writer has a string of failures behind them that gets them to where they need to be.
Does this writer have to live in the greater LA area?
It used to be, yes. It used to be, without a doubt, in television, you had to live in LA. Since the pandemic, it has broadened into, you have writers living all over the world, and the value is you can get writers who are in different places and are at a very high level of talent by not having them have to be in Los Angeles. So I have seen writers live in other places at this point in the entertainment industry and succeed. But the rule of thumb for television is you should be in Los Angeles, unless, for example, if you are a known feature writer, that could change everything. If you are a known feature writer working in different places and you are making the transition into television or streaming, and people are aware of your films, then that can change everything. I know a gentleman who did a thesis who his film became huge in all of the festivals. His film became huge, and he never had to start at the bottom of television because his film did as well as it did in the festival circuit. It had clout in television, and he literally started with selling a pilot and started at the top and never moved to LA.
But that's a rarity.
That's a rarity. That is a rarity. In LA, the value of being in LA is that you are soaking in the business. You are around people who share your passion. You're around the work. And when you're around the work, then you are in a situation where you can create opportunity through getting your work out there. So there is a tremendous value in living here. For writers that live other places, I often advise, don't make the move until you have 3 to 4 very strong scripts in your portfolio. Then you are making the move with a strategy that could serve you and get you to your goal quicker.
Do you think stories like the one you just told about this gentleman who wrote a feature film that did so well, or others we've heard, there's countless names where, $1 million right off the bat.
Yes.
It inspires writers, or it actually hinders them because they think, I'll be the next one. And it actually could stop them from getting a project made because they think it's so, they could just jump cut.
I think it does both. I agree. I think that when you have these huge success stories, just like when you hear it was an overnight success and you don't count the 10 years that went into that overnight success, and writers' perception of the $1 million deal happening to what feels like a newer writer without having any sense of all the work that went into it before that outcome happened. So I think the success of others, writing is like yoga. You have to not compare your journey to anyone else but your own. And the idea of you have to continuously be doing the work to be the best writer that you can be, and somebody else having success or getting further than you should not be something that should uninspire you. It should be something that you see that the dream happens every day in the entertainment business. It happens every day. So anyone that gets stuck in the victim role of it's not going to happen for me, that is going to mean that chances are it won't happen to you, because you have to believe in your talent and your gift in order for the outcome to happen. And people who are getting these $1 million deals are people who are doing the emotional work in that belief as well as the work on the script. And that overall belief is getting them to that outcome.
And then there's also the flip side of sort of this aggressive, like, they can't surpass me. I mean, some people are just hardwired differently.
Yes.
Some people are okay with other people being, ahead of them, so to speak, on the
Yes.
social strata.
Yeah.
And some people, they cannot handle any type of rivalry like that. And I think that fuels certain people too. And it might actually work for them.
I agree. And I always fear, as a former executive, I always fear the idea of the envy and the jealousy of the more higher level writers being frightened of lower level writers that are showing true value. And that's why I think it's so important that all writers do the emotional work. And you can have a lower level writer, and I've seen this happen, that has a tremendous voice that threatens the upper level writers. So they won't get the positive feedback that they need to get to that higher level, or they will feel stunted at a time when they should be celebrated, So that comes down to know your voice, know your gift, believe, and don't get affected by what others say or think. Follow your own trajectory.